He thought it was just another interview, another polite exchange of ideas, another chance to look reasonable on camera. But when Denzel Washington placed a folded piece of paper on the table and asked him one question, the mood shifted. The audience stopped laughing. The lights seemed colder, because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do isn't to shout or to point fingers, it's to hold up a mirror and wait for someone to recognize their own reflection. He thought it was just another conversation, another night of clever lines and polite disagreement, another chance to prove that he could laugh at himself while everyone else laughed along. Bill Maher leaned back in his chair, already reaching for the next quip. The studio lights were warm, the audience comfortably expectant. It felt familiar, predictable, safe. But across from him, Denzel Washington did not smile. He sat with the kind of quiet that does not need to announce itself. His back was straight, his hands resting calmly on the table. There was no tension in his shoulders, no trace of performance in the way he studied Bill's face. Only a measured stillness, like he was waiting for the room to catch up. Without a word, Denzel reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. The movement was unhurried, deliberate. He withdrew a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half, the edges creased from being carried more than once. He set it on the table between them. He did not slide it across with a flourish. He did not punctuate the gesture with a challenge. He simply placed it there, adjusted it by less than an inch, and looked up. For a moment, nothing seemed different. The cameras kept rolling, the lights kept humming. Bill opened his mouth, ready to pivot back into familiar territory, maybe a joke about celebrity activism or another line about the absurdity of outrage. But the words did not come. Because Denzel was not filling the silence for him, he was leaving it intact, letting it expand until it touched every corner of the studio. When he finally spoke, his voice was even. No accusation, no bitterness. Just a quiet gravity that made the audience shift in their seats. "You once said this." He nodded toward the folded paper as though it might speak on its own if given the chance. "You said that silence is complicity." Bill blinked, his expression tightening for just a second before he smoothed it over, but the moment had already registered. A few people in the front row stopped smiling. A cameraman adjusted his grip on the rig, as if to remind himself he was only here to capture it, not to be a part of it. Denzel did not lean forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften the impact with a smile. He simply let the sentence sit there between them, heavier than it should have been. "Silence is complicity." He repeated it, this time quieter, almost to himself, as if testing whether the words still carried the same weight they had the day Bill first said them. "So tell me," he asked, "what changed?" There was no edge in his tone, no triumph in catching someone off guard. If anything, there was something closer to disappointment. Not the loud kind that demands an apology, but the quiet kind that comes when you realize someone you respected has grown comfortable in the very spaces they once condemned. Bill shifted in his seat, searching for a safe place to rest his eyes. The teleprompter, the audience, the cue cards, but everywhere he looked, he was met by the same silent question: what changed? The lights did not seem so warm anymore. The air felt a little thinner, and in that small, unremarkable moment, it became clear that this was not going to be another conversation to laugh through. It was not going to be another show where everyone went home feeling entertained and untouchable. It was going to be something else. Denzel waited. He did not press. He did not explain. He simply sat there, the folded paper between them, like evidence neither of them could pretend was hypothetical. The audience did not applaud. No one laughed. They just watched two men sitting across from each other, and for the first time all night, it felt like something true was about to happen. For a moment, Bill tried to pretend the atmosphere had not shifted. He straightened in his chair, let out a small laugh that sounded too thin in the hush that had fallen across the studio. It was the kind of laugh people make when they sense they are supposed to fill a space with something, anything, to keep it from becoming too real. A laugh offered not because something was funny, but because silence had become suddenly, uncomfortably alive. The audience, caught between reflex and recognition, gave him a few polite chuckles, but they trailed off almost as soon as they began, dissolving into a stillness that felt like it had substance, as if the air itself had grown dense enough to slow every movement. The front row shifted in their seats, some of them glancing from Bill to Denzel and back again, waiting for the familiar rhythm to resume, for the banter to smooth over the jagged edge that had just been revealed. But Denzel was not moving to rescue anyone from that edge. He sat exactly as he had before, back straight, hands resting on the table, the paper still lying between them like an unspoken verdict. His expression had not hardened into accusation, but it had not softened either. It remained steady, the gaze of someone who had no intention of filling the quiet with something smaller than the truth. Bill exhaled a little too loudly, as if he could blow the heaviness away. He tried another laugh, this one even lighter, more brittle. "Look," he began, "I know what this is. You want to catch me in some hypocrisy. That's the game now, right?" His tone had a forced levity to it, the sound of a man determined to re-establish the stage as a place of performance rather than a place of reckoning. A few people in the audience gave him sympathetic smiles. But no one actually laughed this time. No one leaned back in their chair the way they would if they believed he had regained control of the moment. Denzel tilted his head just slightly, studying Bill as if searching for the man who had once said the words on that folded paper. He let the pause stretch, unbroken by rebuttal, unhurried by any need to reassure. Finally, he spoke, voice low and calm. "It's not a crime, Bill." He let the words settle between them, as if granting the sentence permission to become heavier with each heartbeat. "But it is a confession you forgot you made." The last trace of laughter fell away then, not because Denzel had raised his voice or made any overt gesture, but because there was nowhere left for the audience to look except at the fact that the moment had stopped being about entertainment. It had stopped being about winning an argument or scoring a clever line. It had become something that asked everyone listening to decide whether they would keep pretending not to see what was in front of them. Bill shifted again, crossing one leg over the other, tapping two fingers nervously against the armrest. He opened his mouth to say something, closed it, then tried again. "I'm just trying to have a conversation," he insisted, his voice pitched a little higher than before. "That's all." Denzel nodded once, almost imperceptibly, acknowledging the attempt without granting it any power. "That's what you always said. That conversation mattered. That we have to be brave enough to call things what they are, even when it's uncomfortable." His gaze did not waver. "So when did uncomfortable become something you learned to avoid?" The question did not come out like an attack. It came out like a lament, the quiet disappointment of someone who had once believed that clarity mattered more than comfort. Somewhere in the second row, a woman lifted her hand to her mouth and let it rest there, as if the gesture might keep the quiet from seeping into her own thoughts. Near the back, a man who had been smiling since the taping began slowly let his expression fall away. Bill tried to smirk, tried to lean back into the role of unflappable host, but something in his eyes betrayed a fracture, a flicker of uncertainty that the cameras could not quite hide. He gestured vaguely toward the paper. "That quote," he said, forcing another half-laugh, "that was about something else entirely." Denzel's reply came without haste, each word measured. "I don't think truth works that way." The audience did not applaud. They did not gasp. They simply sat in the thinning air, realizing that no one was going to lift the weight of that sentence off their shoulders. For a moment, it felt like even the lights were dimmer, as if they too had decided to stop pretending. And Denzel, still not raising his voice, still not leaning forward, let the silence remain. He did not try to fill it with reassurances or platitudes. He did not reach for humor to soften its edge. He simply held the space, as if he knew the only way to honor the truth was to let it breathe, no matter how uncomfortable it became. And in that quiet, something shifted. Not in Bill's posture or the audience's reactions, but in the deeper recognition that no amount of practiced charm could obscure the simple fact that sometimes silence is not empty. Sometimes it is full of all the things we hoped no one would ask us to name. Bill cleared his throat, the sound small and dry in the hollow quiet. He shifted again, this time leaning forward as if proximity to Denzel might restore the feeling of control he was used to. He spread his hands in a familiar gesture, the one he used when explaining why controversy was simply part of the job. His voice tried to carry the same confident ease, but it fell flat, like a note played on an instrument just out of tune. "I think you're reading too much into this," he said, attempting another tight smile. "I was there to listen, to understand how people think. That's all." He let the sentence trail off, hoping someone in the audience would nod along, confirm that this was reasonable, that this was enough. A murmur moved across the rows, not agreement, not defiance, but something closer to hesitation, the kind of uncertainty that rises when everyone realizes the script no longer fits. Denzel's gaze did not waver. He did not rush to respond or fill the space with new accusations. Instead, he let Bill's words hover in the air, giving them the room to reveal themselves. After a moment, he shook his head, almost gently. "Understanding is important," he said, his voice low and even. "But understanding is not the same as legitimizing." Bill's mouth tightened. He started to interrupt, but Denzel continued, the pace unhurried, as if each word was being chosen with the precision of someone who knew how quickly clarity could be traded for convenience. "You built your reputation on calling things by their name," he said. "You stood on this very stage and said that the worst thing we could do was pretend not to see what was right in front of us." He paused, the silence widening just enough for the memory to settle in. "So when did that stop applying?" Bill looked away for the first time, as though the question had weight he had not expected. A cameraman shifted his footing, trying not to break the fragile tension. No one in the audience moved to fill the quiet with applause or laughter. Denzel exhaled slowly, as if reminding himself that this moment was not about winning. It was about refusing to pretend. "Bridges are good," he continued, his tone almost thoughtful. "We need them. We need places where people can meet and speak and try to understand each other." He let the thought hang for a heartbeat. "But not if you stand on that bridge and watch someone get pushed into the river, then call it exploration." A single sentence, delivered without raising his voice, yet it sliced through the pretense that had protected the conversation from consequence. The image was too vivid to dismiss, too honest to laugh away. Bill shifted again, his hand moving reflexively to the side of his face as if to wipe away something that wasn't there. "That's not what happened," he said, the words coming faster now, pressed into the silence as if he believed he could outrun it. "I didn't push anyone. I didn't cheer. I was just there to see it for myself." Denzel nodded, a small movement that neither conceded nor condemned. "No one said you pushed them," he replied quietly. "But when you stand there, when you don't say anything, when you pretend you're only observing, you have to understand what that looks like to the people in the water." Bill looked up then, his eyes searching Denzel's face for a sign of concession, something he could use to climb back into the safety of irony or detachment. But there was nothing there except the steady presence of a man unwilling to pretend that neutrality absolves anyone. A woman in the front row shifted in her seat, folding her arms across her chest as if to hold something in place. Near the back, a man lowered his gaze to the floor. Denzel did not press the advantage. He did not lean forward to corner Bill in front of the cameras. Instead, he remained exactly as he was, voice measured, gaze level. "You called it bridge building," he said. "Maybe you believed that. But if you come back from that bridge and tell people it was just a field trip, that it wasn't so bad, you give the rest of us permission to look away." Bill's jaw flexed, but he did not speak. "And if you give people permission to look away," Denzel continued, "that's when the worst things start to look normal." Another silence settled, this one different from the earlier ones. Not hollow, not hesitant, heavy. The kind of quiet that feels like the room itself has begun to reckon with the cost of pretending nothing matters. Denzel did not rush to break it. He let it stretch long enough for the audience to realize this was not going to end with a clever line or an applause cue. This was not the kind of conversation you could wrap up neatly and move past. He looked at Bill then, not unkindly, but without compromise. "You once said that the danger wasn't in the shouting. It was in the silence that follows, when decent people decide it's easier to stand still than to speak." He gestured lightly to the paper between them. "So when did you decide standing still was enough?" Bill had no answer ready. For the first time, his face did not carry even the faintest trace of a smile. And the audience understood, perhaps before he did, that the bridge was no longer a metaphor. It was the place they were all standing, deciding whether to watch or to wade in. Bill drew in a breath he hoped would steady him, the kind of slow inhale that usually bought him a moment to regroup. He sat back, forcing a grin that was supposed to look dismissive, as if the conversation had drifted into territory too earnest to take seriously. But the smile did not reach his eyes, and in the sharp studio lights, everyone could see it. He gestured vaguely around them, to the cameras, the audience, the quiet that had settled over the space like a second skin. "You know," he said, voice pitched somewhere between defensive and amused, "it's getting harder to tell when we are having a conversation and when we're staging an inquisition." He tried to let out a small laugh, the kind that usually signaled to the crowd it was safe to laugh too, but no one followed him. The woman in the front row still had her arms folded tight against her chest. A man near the aisle kept glancing down at the floor, as if the carpet might offer him a simpler version of the truth. Denzel did not flinch at the attempt to reframe what was happening. He did not look away or drop his gaze to the table. Instead, he regarded Bill with the quiet patience of someone willing to wait as long as it took for the masks to fall away. When he spoke, his voice did not rise. If anything, it softened, as if he knew that a lower register could sometimes land harder than a shout. "Your words," he said slowly, "used to be a scalpel." He paused, letting the sentence breathe. "They cut through excuses. They exposed what people tried to hide behind polite language and cheap jokes." He watched Bill carefully, not to gloat, not to corner, but to make sure the point had space to land. But somewhere along the way, he continued, that scalpel turned into camouflage. He let the word settle, no flourish. No dramatic pause to summon applause, just the quiet statement of something too obvious to deny. Bill shifted again, rubbing the back of his neck like he could scrub the moment off his skin. He opened his mouth, closed it, then finally found words that felt safe enough to say, "I'm still the same person," he insisted, "but the world keeps moving the line. One day you're brave, the next you're problematic." His voice grew tighter as he spoke, the practiced ease giving way to something rawer. "I've always believed in calling out hypocrisy. I haven't changed." Denzel studied him, the expression on his face neither pity nor condemnation. Just a steady, almost weary kind of recognition. "That's the story we all like to tell ourselves," he said, "that if we started out with integrity, it means we never lost it." He inclined his head a little, his tone softening further, not to reassure, but because the truth did not need extra volume. "But integrity isn't something you earn once and get to keep. It's something you have to prove every time it gets hard to." The words did not strike like a slap. They pressed down instead, the way a hand can gently but firmly push until there is nowhere left to look but inward. Bill let out a sharp exhale, a sound too close to a scoff to be comfortable. "So what?" he asked, forcing a smirk he could not quite sustain. "You think you get to decide when I stopped being useful, when I stopped mattering?" Denzel shook his head slowly. "This isn't about whether you matter." He gestured to the quiet audience, to the cameras that had caught every flicker of the exchange. "It's about whether you're willing to admit that sometimes your silence is more powerful than your words ever were." Bill swallowed, his eyes darting to the monitors, showing his own face in real time. He looked smaller there somehow, like the reflection was catching a version of him that had been carefully edited out of the persona he performed. Denzel continued, voice low and steady. "When you used to speak, you challenged the people who thought power was theirs by birthright. You called out the presidents, the lobbyists, the cowards who hid behind spin." He paused, letting the memory of that version of Bill hang in the air a moment longer before he went on. "But now, the only people who feel safe around you are the ones who are most afraid of losing their place." He didn't raise an eyebrow or tilt his head for emphasis. He simply said it the way you might say the weather had changed. A fact, not an accusation. Bill let out a short, unsteady laugh that no one joined. "You act like I'm some kind of villain," he said, voice hoarse. "Like I crossed a line I didn't even see." Denzel's gaze didn't waver. You didn't have to cross it, he replied. You just had to stand still while someone else did. The room went quiet again, a hush so complete it felt alive. It wasn't the silence of entertainment or the pause before applause. It was the kind of silence that demanded everyone decide whether they still recognized themselves in the man sitting beneath the lights. Denzel looked at him, no rancor in his voice, no triumph in his expression. Sometimes silence doesn't hide you, he said. It reveals you, and there was nothing more to add. Denzel let the last sentence from his mouth dissolve into the hush that had gathered between them. The quiet did not retreat. It did not yield to the practiced rhythm of banter or the easy refuge of laughter. It held steady, as if the air itself had decided that no one here deserved to be rescued from it yet. Slowly, without breaking eye contact, Denzel reached again into the inside pocket of his jacket. The movement was so deliberate it felt ceremonial, like he was retrieving something that did not belong to him but had been entrusted to his care. He withdrew another folded sheet of paper, this one smaller than the first, creased and worn along the edges as though it had been opened and closed more times than the writer could count. He did not place it immediately on the table. He held it between his fingers, smoothing the fold with the back of one thumb, as if to remind himself this was not just a document to be read aloud. It was something fragile, something living. Bill watched him with a guarded expression, wary but unable to look away. Around them, the audience had stilled in the kind of collective anticipation that does not belong to entertainment. It belongs to the moment you realize you are about to hear something you will carry with you, whether you want to or not. Denzel unfolded the paper carefully and lowered his gaze to the words. For a few seconds, he said nothing. He just read silently, his thumb resting against the margin. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all evening, a tone that felt more like a confession than a performance. This, he said, is from a 13-year-old boy in El Paso. He did not look up yet. He let the information find its place in the room before continuing. His name is Kareem. His parents came here from Syria. The name alone seemed to thrum against the quiet. Some in the audience shifted in their seats, not because they were restless, but because it was suddenly difficult to sit perfectly still. Denzel's eyes moved along the page. When he read, he did not perform the words. He did not inflect them for drama. He simply gave them voice, and in doing so, made it impossible for anyone listening to pretend they were hypothetical. They laughed at my name, he read slowly. The words landed without flourish, but they did not need any. I didn't tell my parents. I just asked my teacher if I could sit in the back. He paused, not for effect, but because the sentence demanded it. He lifted his gaze then, letting the audience see the care in his expression. Not pity, not outrage, something deeper and quieter that did not need to announce itself. He lowered the letter to the table, his fingertips resting lightly against the edge. He asked to sit in the back, Denzel repeated, his voice steady, because no one told the room it wasn't okay to laugh. Bill looked down at his hands. He did not interrupt. He did not try to reclaim the narrative. The moment had moved beyond that. The studio was so silent it felt like it might crack under the weight of the story being told. Denzel's tone did not sharpen. He did not raise it to fill the space. He simply continued in that same measured voice. He watched a clip of you and me, Bill, a panel from last year. He let the memory settle around them like dust. We were talking about immigration. Someone made a joke about foreign names. He took in a slow breath, as if reminding himself that sometimes the hardest truths are the ones that sound the simplest. You chuckled. He did not say it as an accusation. He did not say it to humiliate. So did I. The admission sat between them, unexpected in its quiet candor. For a moment, the audience did not know where to place their eyes. Some looked at the floor, some looked at the cameras. But most looked at Denzel, waiting for him to tell them what they were supposed to feel. But he did not. He gave them no instructions, no relief, just the truth. He asked his teacher, Denzel said, voice almost a whisper now, if he should sit in the back next time. Not because anyone told him to, but because no one told the room it was okay. He let the sentence trail off. He did not rush to fill the silence it left behind. The quiet grew heavy again, not like accusation, but like gravity. The kind of gravity that cannot be argued with because it is older and truer than any excuse. Bill shifted in his chair, but he still did not look up. Denzel rested his hands on the table, palms open. "I called the school," he said, "not to defend myself, not to explain." He glanced briefly at the letter before meeting Bill's eyes again. "I didn't mention the clip. I just wanted to know if he was okay." He swallowed once, the movement visible but unforced. "The teacher told me he hasn't spoken in Spanish since." A sound moved through the audience then, not a gasp or a murmur, but something closer to a collective exhale, as if they had all been holding their breath without knowing it. Denzel did not look away from Bill. His expression was unflinching, but it carried no malice, only the same quiet gravity that had been with him since he first placed the paper on the table. "This isn't about canceling comedians," he said. "It's not about being afraid of jokes." He paused, letting the words land without haste. "It's about what happens when the people watching us start believing that silence is how you belong." The audience did not move. No one shifted in their seat. The cameras did not cut away. Denzel lowered his voice, the last sentence more intimate than any that had come before. He asked to sit in the back because he thought disappearing would make him safe. He looked at Bill, eyes steady. "That's the part no one puts in the monologue, the part that doesn't get a laugh." And he let the silence return, heavier now, because it was the only honest way to end. Bill's hands were folded tight in his lap, the knuckles pale under the lights. He lifted his gaze just long enough to find Denzel watching him, then looked away again, eyes drifting to the cue cards on the edge of the table, as if they might offer some exit from this moment. His voice came out rough, brittle with a frustration that sounded like it had been waiting for its chance to surface. "I can't be responsible for every single person who decides to stand near me," he said, each word pushed forward as if by force alone. "You know that, you've been on stages. You've had people claim you were endorsing them just because you didn't shout them down." He stopped, swallowing once, hoping the sentence would sound more reasonable than it felt. But no one applauded. No one shifted the energy back to the safer territory of debate. Denzel did not answer right away. He let the quiet linger, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that some truths require space to be heard at all. His gaze didn't move, steady in a way that made the excuse feel smaller with every passing second. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, and somehow that softness made the words settle even deeper. "You're right," he said. "You're not responsible for every person in the room." Bill's shoulders lifted a fraction, a reflex of relief, as if he thought this might be the moment the conversation finally loosened its hold. But Denzel wasn't finished. He took in a slow breath, as though choosing every word with deliberate care. "But you are responsible for what your silence makes them think you represent." The last trace of relief left Bill's face, replaced by something rawer, a tension that could not be smoothed away by a clever line. Denzel shifted slightly, not in aggression, but in clarity, the way someone does when they want their meaning to be unmistakable. "That day," he said, "there was a man in a red shirt standing near the edge of the crowd." His voice didn't rise, but somehow it seemed to fill the space all the same. "He watched you the whole time. Every time you nodded along, he looked at you like you were giving him permission he didn't deserve." Bill's lips parted as if to interrupt, but the words never formed. "You didn't tell him he was right," Denzel continued, his tone measured, "but you didn't make him doubt it either." He let that rest for a long moment, the kind of pause that demanded more honesty than anyone was sure they could afford. "Sometimes," he said, quieter now, "that's all it takes." He did not look away. "You didn't have to clap or cheer or hold up a sign. You just had to stand there and nod like none of it crossed a line." A murmur moved through the audience, something that was not quite a reaction but closer to recognition. The feeling that what was being named was not theoretical, that it was something they had seen, maybe even done themselves. Bill's hand lifted to rub at the corner of his mouth, the movement shaky. "Look," he began, and his voice had lost the edge it carried earlier. "Look, I talk to everyone. Left, right, sane, crazy. That's the only way we're ever going to fix any of this." Denzel listened without interrupting. He gave Bill the space to say it all, to empty every last justification onto the table between them. And when he finally replied, his voice did not harden. "Talking isn't the problem," he said. "That's not what this is about." He lifted his hands slightly, palm open, as if to underline what came next. "It's what you do after the talking. That's where the consequences begin." The sentence hovered in the studio, a quiet indictment that no one could deflect with a shrug. He glanced briefly at the cameras, then back to Bill. "When someone like that man in the red shirt walks away thinking you're on his side, even if you never said a word, that isn't bridge building." He paused just long enough that the word had time to deepen its meaning. "That's brand confusion." Bill exhaled slowly, but he did not argue. The audience remained silent, their attention locked in the kind of stillness that feels like it might never break. Denzel's gaze softened, though his voice did not. "You think you're being neutral," he said, "but the people watching you aren't neutral about what it means." He leaned back slightly, not to retreat, but to let the quiet expand around the truth he had laid down. "And sometimes," he said, "the line between listening and endorsing is just a nod you never thought mattered." No one moved to fill the pause that followed. No one looked at their phones or glanced toward the exits. Because in that moment, everyone understood that silence doesn't erase responsibility. It only makes it easier to pretend you never had any at all. Denzel let out a slow breath, the kind that did not carry exasperation or anger, but something quieter, something closer to acceptance. It was the acceptance of a man who understood that not every conversation could end with agreement, and not every truth could be softened for comfort. He studied Bill for a long moment, as if searching his face for any trace of the person who had once believed that calling out hypocrisy was a duty and not just a performance. The audience remained hushed, their expressions unguarded now because there was nothing left to hide behind. No laughter to blur the edges, no applause to signal whose side they were meant to be on. Just the stillness that arrives when everyone in the room finally admits to themselves that the cost of pretending has grown too high. Denzel did not look away. He spoke in that same steady tone, each word unhurried, as if he was willing to let it take as long as it needed to reach the places it was meant to go. "Some jokes don't land," he said quietly. He paused, letting the sentence breathe so it could settle deeper. "They stay. They lodge themselves into the ribs of kids like Kareem." The memory of the letter seemed to hover between them, an invisible weight neither of them could set down. He lifted his gaze to meet Bill's directly, not with hostility, but with something more unsettling, a kind of patient insistence. "And when you pretend they're harmless," he continued, "you're not just letting yourself off the hook. You're telling everyone watching that the punchline is worth more than the bruise it leaves behind." Bill's eyes flickered, a small motion that did not disguise how tired he looked, how much older this conversation had made him in the space of an hour. Denzel's expression did not soften into sympathy, but it did not harden either. It simply stayed steady, the look of a man who would not pretend that empathy and accountability had to be enemies. "There's a moment," he said, "when the truth stops being clever and starts being urgent." He did not raise his voice. He did not gesture for emphasis. He only let the words unfold in their own time. "And when that moment comes, you have to choose." He let the sentence hang there, incomplete in a way that made it feel heavier. "You have to decide whether you're going to keep performing the same lines so people don't feel challenged, or whether you're going to say what needs to be said, even if it costs you the room." The quiet returned, deeper than before. The kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but so full of things left unsaid that it pressed against the walls. Bill swallowed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than it had been all night. "So what do you want from me?" he asked. "You want me to stop trying to make people laugh? You want me to stand up and deliver some kind of confession every time someone mistakes my silence for approval?" Denzel considered that without blinking, as if he was turning the question over in his mind to see if it was as complicated as it sounded. "No," he said at last. He tilted his head just slightly, a gesture that was almost gentle. "I want you to understand that every time you decide to keep it all easy, to keep it all funny, you're making a choice." Another pause, the kind that let everyone feel just how little distance remained between the conversation unfolding on that stage and the conversations they avoided in their own lives. And sometimes, Denzel said, you don't get to have it both ways. His eyes stayed locked on Bill S., searching for a flicker of recognition, be funny or be free. He said it without emphasis, almost as if it were an afterthought, but the quiet it left behind was louder than any applause could have been. No one moved to break it. No one dared. The cameras did not cut away. The studio lights did not brighten. For a few long moments, there was nothing in the room but the echo of a choice neither man could pretend had never been offered. And it was there, in that stillness, that everyone watching understood the truth was not waiting for a punchline. It was waiting for them to decide whether they would keep laughing or finally start listening.